forests are more than just trees. Forest, as an old term, is actually a mixture of wildernesses that come together, and that can be a mosaic of habitats, which can be wet woodland, can be open heathland, can be treed, wooded heath, it can be all sorts of different things. So a forest, and this is perfectly personified in the Forest of Dean, is a mixture of all those different types of habitats, and these sorts of grazing schemes and these sorts of habitat restoration projects that have been going on, like at Woorgreens, is a part of that story.
Woorgreens Nature Reserve is the single most important place for wildlife within the Forest of Dean, but it wasn't always that way. Woorgreens was set up back in 1981 from an open cast mine. Many people didn't even know it existed. Habitat has just grown exponentially over the years with Forestry Commission clear felling and contribution of additional open habitat spaces. But the most important launchpad we've had to date is the funding through Forester's Forest Lottery Heritage Fund. This has enabled us to deliver bigger, better and more connected spaces. No longer do we have to rely on simply volunteers and funding for mechanical input to maintain the habitat. We've been able to quadruple the space of habitat for wildlife by taking on conservation grazing. These cattle have been purchased by the project, the fencing has been installed by the project. Importantly, new technology such as no-fence GPS collars have been employed, which means we can now potentially graze additional habitats without even any need for fencing.
A key part of what Forestry England are trying to deliver in the Forest of Dean is around something we call our shared forest. It's a large vision that kind of sets the direction for the Forest of Dean over the next 50 to 100 years, which was widely consulted with the public. And one of the key points that we've come out from that is about restoring natural processes in the Forest of Dean. The forest is a dynamic landscape whereby it's been heavily managed for years and years, if not centuries, whether it's through mining, whether it's through agriculture, whether it's through kind of woodland management. And actually we could do some really benefit for biodiversity and natural processes in themselves by allowing some of those systems to restore.
Conservation grazing means not farming nature reserves, but it means that we have cattle to replicate the large herbivores that are long since gone from this landscape. And importantly, they're helping to eat down some of the vegetation so it doesn't get too big, which means we don't have to do it with mechanical machinery or chemicals. So as you can see, this is one of the younger areas and they're already eating the gorse so it doesn't get too big. Even just simply moving through the habitat means that they're just trampling, they're creating new opportunities. Those young trees there that we'd normally have to clear with volunteers are being subdued by the grazing. I mean, the Forest of Dean has a lot more tree cover today than it did 50, 60, 70 years ago. Conifer production is really important and many wildlife will take advantage of that habitat, but there are specialist species such as reptiles and amphibians and ground nesting birds that are really dependent on these open habitats. And this open habitat is managed purely for wildlife. Now, it's actually quite a new habitat. The conifers have only been removed between 20 and 5 years ago. So all of these new habitats are still developing. But what we hope to achieve here is just the right mosaic of dwarf shrubs. And this allows us to have predominantly heathers and gorse, but lots of grasses and flowering herbs and shrubs. And this provides an infinite set of niches for different species to build their homes, nest and feed. And it's generally the edges of these habitats where you'll get the most transitional value for wildlife. So adders, if they need to hide in dense patches of gorses, but they also need to feed. And they need to feed on predominantly voles, and voles feed on grasses. So the voles are out here, the adders come out and eat them, but if the adders have a vast area of this open habitat, they'll just get picked off by buzzards. So they need to then very quickly move into cover again. So this constant flux of cover and exposure is key. With conservation grazing, there's a lot more going on than just what you can physically see. So yes, the cattle are eating, but obviously they're also converting what they've eaten into their dung. But this dung in itself becomes an opportunity for another species. So dung beetles will specifically feed on this, they'll take the dung away, they'll bury it, they'll create more dung beetles. That's not the end of the story. So those dung beetles at night, they don't literally crawl between the dung, they take to flight. So they'll fly to the next dung so they can smell it. Whilst they're flying, they become prey for bats. So the whole cycle of one species creating opportunities for another just starts to flourish. And this is happening in many, many different ways on the reserve. Creating these open habitats within the forest is a partnership between ourselves and Forestry England. Forestry England have can harvest all of the conifers for us. And the way in which they'll do that, they'll fell the trees, they'll strip the brash off, and they'll use the brash as a mat to float them over the soil so that they don't damage and break the soils for future use. Now this brash would actually hinder the regeneration of the sort of habitats we want. So we then rake the brash and we create these islands where all of the brash is pushed up against the edge of the retained conifers. And this means that we've built into our habitat lots of refuge in the hibernacula for adders and amphibians, but equally we've prepared the ground so that although it will be dominated initially by soft rushes, we will eventually start to see other flowering species such as heathers move in. There are plenty of retained stumps, and these stumps will rot down and they'll create little nooks and crannies for hibernating and refuge for amphibians as well. And then there's lots of ditches that are partially blocked, so we have a constant changing level of water in here. The habitat we're in here is predominantly soft rush, which might not look particularly diverse, but you shouldn't assess a habitat just purely with your eyes. There's infinite amount of invertebrate activity here because of all the bare soils. There's crickets, there's micro moths, there's small heath butterflies. Floristically, it's not particularly diverse at the moment, but on an invertebrate level, it's really, really active. The momentum of this project can be continued now because the Wildlife Trust has ownership of the cattle, we have leases with the Forestry Commission for these sites, and we have all of the infrastructure required to be able to maintain this for many years coming.